Namaskar and thank you very much, Abhay-ji, Sucheta-ji. Can I be heard clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. This is a very special kind of joy and privilege to be able to speak on traditions of Shakti worship on a day like today, which is Mahanavami and Vijayadashami being celebrated all over the country. So thank you very much, Jigyasa, for this wonderful idea. Let me begin with just a few comments on Hinduism itself, and then on Hinduism in Kashmir historically, and then zoom in to our specific topic of Shakti worship in Kashmir. Now, Hinduism, you must have heard, is often referred to as a polytheistic religion. That is where multiple gods are worshipped. Now, this is perhaps a misnomer. And the image that this conjures of a crowded, chaotic miscellany of gods that we all worship is less accurate for Hinduism than perhaps the other concept of kathenotheism or henotheism, which is what? Kathenotheism refers to the phenomenon where there is supreme worship of one god, even as multiple others are recognized and worshipped. Now, you can all recognize that for Hinduism, these supreme gods are quintessentially Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess, that is, Shakti, in all her different forms. Again, Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti are not worshipped in isolation from one another, but in association with one another. As anyone who is familiar with Indian mythology will tell you, one always makes an appearance in the story and in the divine career of the other, and so on. Now, alongside this Kathenotheism, however, is also a fundamental monist strain in Hinduism, monism. That is to say, this is not some haphazard multitude of gods that we are looking at, but a deep belief alongside in an underlying unity of Godhead and ultimately unity of consciousness, which is above and beyond even the gods. And this has been variously described as non-duality or Advait. Now, why am I giving this background? Because in Kashmir, historically, we see the presence of all these trends. All Hindu gods are, somebody is speaking in the background. Somebody needs to go mute. 1+7 needs to go mute. Okay. So I was saying that this little background that I gave you about multiple gods, one supreme god being worshipped, but alongside also a monism that believes in the unity of all creation and ultimately of consciousness itself, of which God is only a part. All these trends historically we see in Kashmir. All Hindu gods are worshipped by Kashmiri Hindus, and I'm speaking historically now. So for the last 2,500 years at least, Vishnu, Shiva, Parvati, Ganesh, Kartikeya, Saraswati, Matrikas, Surya, and even conjoined forms of gods like Harihara. And there is abundant historical evidence of this from Kashmir. Some of you who were there in my last talk on Kashmir will recall the images we saw. The many, many images we saw of all these gods from Kashmir from very early. But alongside, they also developed in Kashmir a revered form of monist mysticism called Kashmir Shaivism, or more properly, Shaiva Shaktism, in which Paramashiva is worshipped as the ultimate cosmic reality. This system was known as Trika, or the system of three: Shiva, Shakti, and Nara. Now, Nara is the individual creation or the individual soul. But Shakti, the feminine divine, the goddess consort of Shiva, is none other than primeval energy herself, the active principle of creation, Vimarshini, as she is called, in union with Shiva. So Shakti worship then was and remains central to Kashmir. The feminine divine, however, can be studied in different ways. One would be the theological perspective, that is, looking at the nature and functions and symbolism of the goddess, often esoteric. The other related way of talking about the goddess is iconological, that is, looking at how the goddess was represented in a variety of media, like stone or clay, and why. That is, what is the rationale behind that very detailed depiction of the goddess. In this talk, however, we shall not go into the theology or the iconology of the goddess. I shall instead try to show that below the level of esoterics, at the level of popular conceptualization and practice, goddess worship in Kashmir was not so much iconographic as it was topographic. In other words, I will look at the geomythologies within which god and goddess cults were conceived in Kashmir, both textually and on the ground. I will argue that Shakti is tied up intimately with the way the land of Kashmir itself has been understood and mapped over time, as seen in her founding texts, Nilmath Puran, 8th century CE, Kalhanj Rajtarangini, 12th century CE, and the Bhringisha Samhita, 17th century CE. I will focus on river, spring, and hill goddesses with a detailed reference to the three paramount Devis of Kashmir worshipped to this day, Sharada, Sharika, and Raganya, all forms of Shakti. True to the pan-Indian pattern, mythology and geography in Kashmir were a joint imaginative and descriptive undertaking. Geographical knowledge was grounded in the mythical apprehension of the world's meaning and order, even as myth-making and religion itself were resonant with the natural markers of the land, which generated a sense of place and rootedness in the valley. Thus, in the very beginning of the Rajtarangini, which is supposed to be the first history of Kashmir, we get the casting of a bird's eye over the physiography of Kashmir, her landscape. Kashmir is called the country magnificent with its mountains and the land of rishis and devatas. The text says, quote, "In the three worlds, the earth is worthy of praise. On the earth, the northern direction is worthy. In the north, the Himalaya mountain, father of Parvati, is praiseworthy. And within the Himalayas, the country of Kashmir." Unquote. So the founding location of Kashmir is in the Himalayas, and the Himalayas are none other than the father of Parvati. Kalhan continues with this scheme to sanctify the entire topography by merging physical geography of the land with sacred geography. What do I mean? A description of the rivers, lakes, and mountain peaks of Kashmir is interspersed seamlessly with an enumeration of the many tirthas. Tirthas are the shrines or the pilgrimage spots that accompany the physical features of the land. Thus, we are told very early in the text of the tirthas of Papasudan, Nandikshetra, Chakraprith, Vijayesh, Adikeshava, and Ishana, and of the hill goddess Sharada, about whom we'll hear much more in this talk, and the Bheda mountain atop which resides goddess Saraswati, and so on and so forth. Mind you, these are not mythic or imaginary sites. All of these have been identified by scholars in modern Kashmir. Mark Orlstein undertook an extensive survey in the late 19th century, and all of these have been located on the ground in Kashmir. In sum, in the Rajtarangini, we are told of how, quote, "In this country adorned by these tirthas, there is not so much land as covered by a sesamum seed, which is profane. So there is not even this much land in Kashmir which is not sacred, says the text. So a close association of the very land of Kashmir with spiritual merits, that is with Punya Papa Nam Anvaya Vyatihi, the presence of piety and the absence of sin. This is initiated for Kashmir by this text. And it is memorably continued by Kalhan when he calls Kashmir, quote, Vijiyate Punya Balair Balair Yattu na Shastrinam, the country which may be conquered by spiritual merit, Punya, but not by armed force. He also says in the same verse, learning, high dwelling houses, saffron, iced water, grapes, and the like. What is commonplace in Kashmir is difficult to get even in paradise, unquote. This verse, invoking the spirituality as well as the paradisical qualities of Kashmir, and for the first time, please note, suggests a combined claim to piety and pleasures for the land. And this is exactly the characterization that is found in the earlier Nilmat Puran as well, which describes Kashmir as Ramniyascha Punyascha, both holy and charming. Now, embodying both the holiness and charm of Kashmir were its innumerable rivers, lakes, and springs. In fact, the texts bring with themselves a sense of the land of Kashmir being a landscape of water. Water is the originary motif in the Puranic cosmogonic account of the valley. In this account, Kashmir is called Sati Saras, or the lake of Sati, another name of Shakti, the wife consort of Shiva. There is thus a founding association of the land of Kashmir with the goddess, which is spectacular. The very name Kashmir is also said to carry within it the syllable for water, Ka, as the Nilmat Puran tells us. Please note that this is the first of several myths which combine geology and tradition in Kashmir. Why do I say that? Because we know scientifically that the geomorphological formation of the Kashmir Valley did occur from a primordial lake, which is evidently a memory that is preserved in this myth of the Sati Saras and the draining of the Sati Saras later because of the presence of a demon called Jalodbhava who lived there and was terrorizing the inhabitants. And therefore the residents go and appeal to Rishi Kashyap, who then calls upon the gods, all the gods, interestingly, to come and to drain out the lake, which is essentially instrumentally achieved by Balaram using his hala to break the embankment of the lake, leading to the drying out of this Sati Saras, so that people could thereafter reside there after Jalodbhava was killed. What is more, both in the myth and in science, in geology, we know that the valley did not drain out completely when this happened. Whenever this happened, it did not drain out completely. And instead, a number of residual lakes, pools, and springs have remained in Kashmir, inaugurating what we can call a wetland ecology. These pools or lakes are known as Kund. Kund, or more commonly in Kashmir, they're called Naga. Now, Naga is also the term for serpent, as you all know, and refers to both the lakes and their tutelary deities in Kashmir. So the Naga serpents are supposed to be the deities of these lakes, which are also therefore called Nagas. And so in the Rajtarangani too, Kashmir is described as, quote, the land of the Nagas, which is under the protection of Nila, the king of the Nagas, whose chhatra is the swelling Neelakunda, Verinag, modern Verinag, and I will show you pictures of this. And the flowing waters of the Vitasta, modern Jhelum, are his dandi, his staff, unquote. So look at this little piece of imagery which combines both geography and mythology and sets it up beautifully as a tradition for the land itself. Land of the Nagas, which is under the protection of Nila, who is the king of the Nagas, whose parasol is the Nilakunda or Verinaga, from which flows the Vitasta, which is modern Jhelum. So after this opening statement, which enshrines the river and its lake as central to the idea of Kashmir, significantly in both the Nilmat and the Rajtarangani, the river Vitasta herself is declared the embodiment of the goddess Parvati. So the text tells us, Vitasta yatra Parvati tatra Kashmiraha. Where Vitasta is Parvati, that is Kashmir. But that is not all. We are also told that Kashmir herself is Parvati. Kashmiraha Parvati Raja Tatra Haranshajah Yeyo. The Nilmat Puran and then the Rajtarangani both have no less than Lord Krishna declare this. The land of Kashmir is Parvati. Know that and know her king to be a part of Shiva, Haranshajah. So Kashmir is instated as the very body of Shakti. This is extremely important to remember to understand what is called the place consciousness of Kashmir. Kashmir is Parvati. Indeed, the many perennial rivers with which Kashmir is blessed constitute the most ubiquitous form of the feminine divine in Kashmir. The Nilmat enumerates as many as 28 rivers in a set of 7 shlokas. They spell out the ensigns and the specific attributes of each river, as well as their vahanas, such as the Vitasta has the fish as its vahan, the Ganga river in Kashmir has the crocodile as its vahan, the Chandrabhaga or the Chenab has the lion as its vahan, and so on. And after doing this, just like you do for gods and goddesses, the text then actually identifies every river with different goddesses. So the river Saraswati is identified with Kashmira, Devika with Vitasta, Vitasta also with Uma, Vipasha or Vyas with Amogakshi, and so on. All of these being forms of Shakti. So what is happening here? A sacralizing of the complete riverine network of Kashmir is attempted, and in a fashion that both appropriates the pan-Indic goddess Shakti as well as rivals iconic rivers of the Indic supra-region like Ganga and Yamuna that were long invested with boon-giving and celestial powers. What do I mean? The Nilmat Puran says, quote, the Ganga does not excel the Vitasta. The Vitasta supersedes the Ganga, as the Ganga only leads to heaven, while the Vitasta paves the way to moksha, to salvation. One also hears of the category of Sapta Ganga, or 7 Kashmiri rivers deemed to be as venerable as the Ganga. In keeping with the deemed sanctity of rivers that were the goddess incarnate, a host of pious ceremonies like Homa, Vrata, Upavasa, etc., and an entire ritual economy was founded on the banks of Kashmir's rivers at the numerous redemptive tirthas that emerged along these rivers. River banks also became the locus of river festivals, Nadi Maha, which incidentally is a very old practice found across the Indian subcontinent. Some of the earliest references you get are from Panini's Ashtadhyayi and also in the Jataks and in the Mahabharata. So again, a subcontinental practice of worshipping on the banks of rivers, Nadi Maha. The worship of Vitasta, for example, Jhelum, was undertaken in a week-long festival in the lunar month of Shravan, that is, end July to end August. It began with the propitiation of Varuna, the god of water, and of Uma and Dhanada on the 5th day of the new moon, On the 6th and 7th days, virgins, Kumari, representing both the goddess and the river, were bathed, anointed, and worshipped there. So again, this Kumari Puja is found as a part of the Navratras across the country, as you know. On the 9th day, people offered flowers, food prepared from sugar, incense, bedding, and blankets. On the 10th day, Uma, and Uma here is Vitasta, right? Vitasta is Parvati. Uma was worshipped as a bride with incense, food, earthen lamps, garland, curd, grain, sugar, saffron, kajal, bangles, and so on. And on the 13th day, the birthday of Vitasta was observed with people fasting and performing vocal musical performances. You get this whole description of a very beautiful, long, 2-week long festival of the river Vitasta or Uma in the Nilmat Puran. Now, especially sacred among Tirthas were deemed the confluence of rivers, what we understand as Sangam, such as those of the many boon-giving and sin-bearing tributaries of Vitasta, like Saraswati, Trikoni, Vishoka, Chandravati, and Paroshni, when they joined the Vitasta. So all such places of confluence of the tributaries of the Vitasta with the Vitasta in Kashmir became extremely important tirthas. I suppose all of you know the word tirtha itself actually refers to a river crossing. It refers to the very act of crossing over, physically a river, but metaphysically crossing over the Bhav Sagar, crossing over Sansar towards moksha. So this is where these tirthas are very fittingly found in Kashmir at the confluence of these sacred rivers of the land. River goddesses became the motif for purging sins and attaining purity. And by all the sin-bearing rivers of the region, ultimately merging into the Vitasta, who is the goddess Uma, all of Kashmir was deemed to be purified. So it's a whole riverine network of sacredness. And indeed, at one such supremely holy confluence stands to this day one of the greatest shrines of Kashmir, that of goddess Sharada. Goddess Sharada is she who lent her name to Kashmir as Sharada Desh in ancient times. The Peetha, or the shrine of goddess Sharada, and Sharada is two different forms of goddess combined. She is both Parvati and she is Saraswati, the goddess of learning. So the Sharada Peeth stands on an elevated alpine spur beside the confluence of the rivers Madhumati and Saraswati. Saraswati is modern Kishan Ganga. And this is happening in a village named Sharadi in a region called Neelam, which lies just beyond the line of control in Pakistan occupied Kashmir. I will be showing you photographs of this monument. Now, a great deal of local lore surrounding the goddess Sharada survives, which again connects her inextricably with the local topography. So I just want to remind you that what is the larger point that this talk is making? It is about explicating goddess worship, Shakti worship in Kashmir in the context of Kashmir's topography. The very land is implicated in Shakti worship in Kashmir. That is the argument I'm trying to make. So let's see some of these tales, which are captured in the Sharada Mahatmya, which is found in the 17th century Bhringisha Samhita. According to this myth cycle, when the war was to break out in Lanka between the Vaishnava incarnation Rama and the demon king Ravan, the goddess Parvati, who was in Lanka for some reason at that time, was relocated from Lanka to the north by Hanumanji. And in what form? He would be flying from Lanka to the north of India. So on that journey, he takes Parvati along in the form of water carried in a kamandala or a jar. Nearing his destination in the Himalayas, wherever drops of water fell by mistake from the kamandala, look at the naturalistic handling of this myth. It is so beautiful and so detailed. Wherever drops of water would fall by mistake on the journey in the Himalayas part of his tour, there formed a holy lake or a spring. And in this way came into being all along the route to the Sharda shrine and visible to this day, a series of other lakes and tirthas. The Masanag in Gushi, a pond 700 square feet in area, this is 700 square feet, and it is some miles ahead. Then further down that route, Devi Balnaga in Tikri with its color changing waters. Further above, the Krishnagar, where pilgrims would stop to bathe, followed by the spring in Tehjan or Tejavan, as mentioned in the Mahatmya. And finally, after this Himalayan journey of Hanumanji is over, atop a hillock some 3 miles ahead of Tejavan, he puts down this goddess-bearing Kamandala. So the Kamandala is finally put down, and this is the spot where the sanctum sanctorum of the Sharada Peeth lies. The goddess, therefore, exists in the form of a subterraneous spring or kunda. And it is marked, this kunda is marked in the shrine by the presence of a rough slab of stone, 6 feet by 7 feet and half a foot thick. These are the dimensions we get from Stein during his survey in the late 19th century. So this is Sharda Ma. Parvati herself brought from Lanka to Kashmir in a Kamandala, following the formation of a series of little lakes, and finally the Sharda shrine. It bears emphasis. According to another myth also, this is also the spot where the goddess Sharda revealed herself to Rishi Shandilya. So there are myths upon myths relating to the same spot, but obviously something very special about it. And it bears emphasis again that it is this underground kunda, this natural water body, that is the object of veneration. There is substantial evidence that the shrine of Sharada, and Sharda, as I said, came to be identified as the presiding goddess of Kashmir, Sharda Desh. This shrine of Sharda was not just a local or a regional cult, but actually came to acquire subcontinental renown already in the 8th century CE, as early as that. That is when the Rajtarangani tells us pilgrims from 1,000 miles away, as far as Gauda or Bengal, would journey all the way to Sharda Peeth to offer prayers to the great goddess. In the 9th century, we know that Adi Shankaracharya, starting out from Kerala, culminated all 3 of his pan-Indic Digvijayas at Sharda Peeth, which he describes as Sarvagya Peeth, that is the seat of all knowledge. Al-Biruni, in the 11th century, he is the Arab traveler. He also enumerates the Sharada Peeth as one of the 4 most important temples of all Hind, so the entire subcontinent. The others being the Linga at Somnath, Chakraswamin at Thaneshwar, and Surya at Multan. He also spoke of a miracle working image at Sharada Peeth that on particular days of the month would shake and produce heat and sweat. And it's interesting that this account is also given 5 centuries later by Abul Fazl, the Mughal historian. Now, these facts that I've given about Sharda's subcontinental renown, you will recall my argument in the last talk about the connected histories of Kashmir and the rest of India. And this is just one more example of how these connected histories were so thick between Kashmir and the rest of the subcontinent. Now, like the river goddess, the goddess Sharada is a fine illustration of the popularity of the worship of natural springs and lakes in Kashmir as forms of Shakti. This widespread practice is illustrated by the centrality of 2 other cults in Kashmir, that of the Nagas and that of Kheer Bhavani, our second Devi for the day. But first, the Nagas. We hear in the Nilmad Puran that the Nagas, who, as I told you, are serpent gods who resided in the lakes of Kashmir, they were worshipped by the people through ceremonies, through Yatra Yagadi, that is customary pilgrimages and sacrificial offerings. Some of the famous Nagas that we hear are Veri Nag, I told you about it, the source of the Vitasta, and I will also show you an image of that. Sheshanag, white-watered Sheshanag, which is on the way to the Amarnath cave. I will again show you illustrations. And the Mahapadmanag, which is none other than the famous Wular Lake. The Wular Lake is the largest freshwater lake in Asia, and it lies in North Kashmir. However, we are not focusing on the Nagas today. They are not the only deities found in association with springs in Kashmir. So are the goddesses. And an outstanding example of a great goddess cult that is centered on a spring like this is that of Kheer Bhavani, also called Merj Kheer Bhavani by Kashmiris, Mother Kheer Bhavani. This is located at a tirtha called Tulmul, which is ancient Tulya Mulya, as the Rajtarangani enumerates it. And it is located some 14 miles out of Srinagar. So please note the antiquity and also the continuity of all these sites of Shakti worship in Kashmir. They survive till today against drastic odds, as we all know. So at Tulmul, Shakti or Durga here appears in her Sattvic form, that is tranquil and blissful, not Raudra or the furious form. So in her Saumya Roop. And here she is known as Raganya Devi. Raganya Devi, a very beloved and venerable Devi, Kula Devi of Kashmir. Raganya Devi at Kheer Bhavani is worshipped with milk and rice, that is in strictly vegetarian ways. Hence the name Kheer Bhavani, which is from the Sanskrit Kshir, Kshir for milk pudding or kheer. Her shrine is located on a little islet in the middle of a pond. And the waters of this pond are deemed miraculous because they change colors on their own, from milky white to blue to red or pink, orange, green, and worst of all, black. Why do I say worst of all? Because black, when her waters turn black, it is believed by Kashmiris that it portends some evil occurrence. And this phenomenon has actually been attested historically. So Abul Fazl in the 16th century talks about this, that her waters change according to whether the conditions in Kashmir are auspicious or hostile. Then again, Swami Vivekanand, when he visits Kashmir in the 19th century, he talks about the same thing. And interestingly, in recent history, 1947, when the tribals from Pakistan invade Kashmir, in fact, on a date that has just passed, 23rd October, 1947, local tradition has it that the waters of Kheer Bhavani changed color to dark black just before this invasion. So it's fascinating, the intimate connection between the land, the beliefs of the people, and the fortunes of Kashmir, the vicissitudes that Kashmir goes through. And I will again show you photographs of this beautiful water body. So Kheer Bhavani today is one of the most revered tirthas of the goddess for all Hindus and not only Kashmiris. Mention should also be made of another spring tirtha, since we are speaking about it. This is of the goddess Saraswati, who the Rajtarangani mentions appears as a swan in a lake atop the Bheda Hill. The Bheda Hill is modern Budbror. Budbror is South Kashmir. And here Saraswati is believed to have appeared before Rishi Pulastya, who prayed for Ganga to arise here in Kashmir. And so this place is also called the Ganga Bheda Tirtha, the Udbhed, the arrival of Ganga. What is interesting is that this Bheda Hill, though it is 7,800 feet high, snow does not fall within 350 feet of the sacred lake atop this hill. So it is an all-weather lake, and just around this lake, on top of such a high mountain peak, snow doesn't fall. And all around there is snow. So this is again supposed to be a miracle work of the goddess. And this is again attested by Abul Fazl. So medievally also, this seems to be the practice. Now, the third and highly revered goddess of Kashmir may be described as a hill goddess. She is Jagadamba Sharika Bhagavati, the 18-armed Ashtadash Bhuja, the 18-armed Ishta Devi of Srinagar, whose shrine is found on the west face of the iconic hill named Hari Parbat. So you have Srinagar and you have the Hari Parbat mountain on one side, and just opposite is the Shankaracharya mountain, Shankaracharya peak, where his Peetha lies. So these two iconic pilgrimage centers, worship places of Kashmir, lying just across each other. Now, Hari Parbat. Hari is the local Kashmiri word for the Sharika bird, because Sharika, by the way, is the minor bird, which in English I think is called the sterling. So the Sharika in Kashmiri becomes Shar becomes Har. So Hari Parbat. Kashmiri and Sanskrit are cognate languages. Kashmiri is a mountain dialect in the Indo-Aryan family of languages. So Sharika becomes Har and Hari Parbat. Now, this Sharika bird, so the Sharika bird, according to legend, the goddess assumed the form of this Sharika bird to bring about the end of a demon residing in the valley. Now, some stories say this demon was called Bakasur, and other stories say it was Jalodbhava again. In any case, this divine bird Sharika, the goddess taking her form, is said that on the Ashad Shukla Paksha Navami, this divine bird lifted a celestial pebble in her mouth and dropped it on this demon, crushing it to death. So what was a tiny pebble for this divine bird became a giant hill by the time it fell on the Rakshas, on the Asur, and crushed it to death. This pebble then came to rest on the Hari Parbat and became the goddess incarnate. Thus, there is not an icon, there is no image, there's not an icon, but a giant rock Shila that is the object of veneration at the shrine of Sharika Devi. And I'll show you, I'll give you darshan of this divine Shila. And the Shri Yantra or the Shri Chakra is also said to be self-engraved, Swayambhu, on this rock, so that another of the names of Sharika Devi is Chakreshwari. And incidentally, at this shrine, you also have iconographic representations of Sharika Devi as the Ashtadash Bhuja goddess seated atop a lion. And you also have yantras. So you can worship Sharika Devi as a yantra as well. This is the tantric aspect of Kashmir Shaktism. And this can be worshipped in individual households as well. Another very interesting thing about Sharika Devi is that she is one goddess who you can offer non-vegetarian offerings to. So you know that Kashmiri Hindus, Kashmiri Pandits, they partake of mutton and fish. So the goddess Kheer Bhavani, we saw Raganya Devi, she is vegetarian form of Shakti. So you can only offer milk and rice and such sattvic things to her. But to Raganya Devi, you can actually worship her with the offering of mutton and fish as well. So what is interesting is that the Navratras are on right now. When Kashmiri Pandits celebrate the Navratras, on the Navami day, when they perform the final puja, what do? They cook kheer for Raganya Devi. Then they put a small chapati, a roti on it. And on top of that roti, separated from the kheer by the roti, they put a little piece of what in Kashmiri is called sarvan. Sarvan is roasted liver. So what are they doing? They are not mixing the two goddesses, but they are propitiating both, separated by a little chapati. And that is how Navami is celebrated, both Sharad Navratras and Chaitra Navratras. That is the Navami that is held in April. So that is all about Sharika Devi. Sharika Devi, Raganya Devi, and Sharda Devi are iconic to Kashmiris. So in some senses, you can say they are inseparable from Kashmiri identity itself. And today I've shown you how historically they are also actually embodied in the land and the waters of Kashmir. So they're a part of Kashmiri place consciousness and Kashmiri identity as well. Let me just conclude by raising a question. How do we account for all this? I am a historian. We need to respond to this academically as well as devotionally. So how does one account for this profusion of goddess mythology that is built around the natural features of the land of Kashmir? Some historians tend to see this as a process of what they call Puranic or Sanskritic hegemonization of a region that they say was peripheral to the Indic heartland. So the Indic heartland, they identify with the Ganga Valley. And then they say this is the process of ideological acculturation through the agency of Brahmanas, and therefore also an act of Brahmanization of a postulated non-Brahmanical land and people. This is what some scholars, I would like to say, assume rather than demonstrate. Now, there are a number of problems with this theory, which is full of assumptions. And I have critiqued this theory at length in my book, The Making of Early Kashmir. Today, let me just speak very quickly about only a couple of the problems with this theory. What this theory or this approach implies is that Hinduism was a top-down phenomenon handed down to the people by priests rather than seeing Hinduism as an aggregate of the people's own variegated beliefs and practices. I believe that the genre of Purans themselves, which bring together a vast body of very heterogeneous materials, including free-floating popular or folklore, such as we saw for Kashmir as well. I believe this kind of evidence from history is the best example of the heterogeneity and grassroots formation and composition of Shaiva, Shakta, and Vaishnava cults themselves. So these cults actually formed through history from very popular folk origins. So we are at the very least looking at an interact, and especially Shakti. The representation of Shakti in other parts of India as well, whether it is Bengal or whether it is South. And there are tremendous overlaps between the terminology, the iconography, Channa, Mastaka, Tripura Sundari, Mahakali, Jyeshtha, Jwala. These are the kind of names of the goddesses you're getting across the country. And everywhere else that the goddess is being worshipped, as I said, whether it's Bengal or in the South, you see, again, the similar folk origins, even forest origins of the goddess, especially in her Rodra Roop. So what kind of imposition from the top are we talking about? These cults are very much forming out of the people's beliefs themselves. So we are at the very least looking at an interaction between Sanskritic literary traditions and people's beliefs, not religion as a unilinear, elite, or priestly product. Moreover, this theory of Puranic hegemonization or Sanskritization of Kashmir is itself a perspective from the Gangetic Valley, from the Ganga Valley, which is being seen as the center by these scholars. And so what it does is to position Kashmir as a periphery to that center. But as I have demonstrated at great length, again in my book, and I talked about this in my last talk as well, Kashmir was no periphery at all, but enjoyed a founding centrality to Indic civilization for at least 2000 years, pioneering most of the cultural and intellectual movements across the subcontinent. Again, the connected histories is what I'm referring to. So what happened in Kashmir then was not a mere passive reflection of what was happening in the Supra region. It was a statement instead on Kashmir's own identity, which was birthed through the medium and idiom of Sanskrit, but which remained nonetheless closely rooted in the local geography, as we have just seen for Shakti worship. Indeed, Hinduism has always been a highly locative religion. And I will remind you of my opening comments on the role of myth and geography when I suggest that Purans typically constructed geobiographies or geocults of a region, and this offered a standard format within which regions like Kashmir could infuse and express their own vernacular character and traditions of Shakti worship. Thank you very much. Allow me now to talk you through a PowerPoint that I have made for the occasion, after which we can take on questions. Viniti, am I, how do I?
So you can click on share screen.
No, how do I go back to my original large screen? One sec. I'm getting, okay, I'm back.
All right.
Share screen and, okay. 1 minute, I need to open my PowerPoint. Can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint. If you put it on presentation mode, then we won't see the entire. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
So this is what we have been talking about today. This is the region we are speaking of, Jammu and Kashmir, but we are talking specifically of the Kashmir Valley. You can see Srinagar there. That plain little elongated area running southwest to northeast is the Valley of Kashmir. It is surrounded by Jammu and Ladakh. And of course the Himalayas, the Zanskar range you can see, and south of Kashmir is the Pir Panjal range. These are the two sub-ranges of the Himalayas. This is a close-up that will tell you about the topography, because our argument for today is precisely how the worship traditions of Kashmir are so rooted in the mountain and wetland ecology and topography of Kashmir. She is who we are talking about, Shakti, Durga, and Parvati in all her different forms, such recognizable forms across the world. If you're an Indian or a Hindu, or perhaps not even a Hindu, I think you will immediately recognize who she is. So when we see her occurring in a regional context like Kashmir's, as we have been doing for the last 1 hour, we are again reminded of the connected histories of Kashmir. How you have exactly the same conception of Shakti occurring across the subcontinent. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that there are different ways in which you can talk about the goddess, and one of these was iconographic. So in Kashmir, from very early, you are getting iconographic representations of the goddess for sure. Here is Durga Mahishasur Mardini, approximately 8th century CE, found at Tengapura in Kashmir. I showed this image last time as well. So you may remember the interesting story around her. This image was actually stolen and smuggled out of Kashmir, finally ends up in Germany, and the government only a few years ago took steps to bring her back, and now she's safely in Srinagar Museum again. Shiva and Parvati with family, Ganeshji and Kartikeya, what a blessed sight on Mahanavami and Vijayadashmi today, again from Kashmir, 9th or 10th centuries CE. So iconographic representations are happening. Please do not go away from this talk saying that, no, the goddess is worshipped only as a spring or a river or a hill in Kashmir. No, you are getting these regular, conventional, pan-Indic forms of representing the goddess as well. But what we talked about was a special connection with the land. Beginning with the rivers of Kashmir, I hope you can see the solitary blue line in this photo that is running through Kashmir and Srinagar, and then taking a sharp curve down south at a place called Baramulla, which you would have heard of, and then goes further to join Indus. Verinag, which you've been hearing about in my talk today, also known as Neelakunda, is deemed to be the source of the Vitasta. This is what Verinag looks like today. The brick constructions around her, of course, are later day. They are approximately medieval. But this is supposed to be the sacred origins of the Vitasta. And here is the Vitasta herself, modern Jhelum. But as our texts tell us across the centuries, she is Parvati herself in all her glory. The Sharda Peeth. This is the sad visage of the Sharda Peeth today. She lies in utter neglect in Pak-occupied Kashmir. This doesn't give the impression of this immensely prestigious shrine that we were talking about throughout history. This is her location. See the alpine spur she's standing on. You can't see the confluence of Kishanganga and Saraswati in this photograph, but it is not too far off. This overwhelming natural beauty that surrounds the Sharda shrine. This is in the winters, a very cinematic recap of the Sharda Peeth, but nonetheless in ruins. This, however, is a photo of the Sharda Peeth not so long ago, in the end of the 19th century. It's a photo taken by the explorer Mark Orelstein, and you can see that it is a functioning temple as late as the end of the 19th century. You can see the Om that is written on it. You can see a doorway. You can see the Kashmiri Pandit priest who is standing in front in his typical ferran, the long ferran, and the turban. These are two markers of Kashmiri Pandit men. And I will show you some representations of Kashmiri Pandit women in a short while. We spoke about the famous Nagas of Kashmir, who are also worshipped. And I mentioned the Sheshanag, which is en route to the Amarnath cave. Here she is, and she's known for her milky waters. The Rajtarangani calls her the milky waters of Sheshanag, and you can see very clearly why. They are indeed white. And this is the famous Amarnath Yatra, and it is en route to the Yatra that you pass the Sheshanag. The Mahapadmanag, or the Wular Lake that I mentioned, you can see from the appearance of these beautiful bodies, water bodies, why they would be considered divine. Kheer Bhavani, Mata Raganya, Kheer Bhavani at Tulmul. Please notice the color of the water. This is a photograph, fortunately, taken just a few days ago during the Navratras by a friend of mine in Srinagar. And you can see how beautifully auspicious the waters are. They are clear, they are bright, they are blue. And the goddess is seated deep within that little shrine in the middle of this spring or this islet. These are photos from another time, several years ago. Again, the waters are white, so auspicious. And they have a sacred visitor as well, the Sri Shankaracharya from the Kanchi Peeth. Hari Parbat, the temple that is built around Sharika Devi, who we spoke about last. This is a close-up of the Shila that I told you about. This is the pebble that fell from the mouth of Sharika Devi, which became the goddess herself. This is the Shila that is worshipped. There are little shrines all around, which also have iconographic images of the goddess sitting in her Ashtabhuj avatar over the lion and so on and so forth. But this is the main Shila, the revered Sharika Devi shrine for all Kashmiris. This is another photograph, and the Sri Chakra I mentioned is approximately here. You can't make it out from a distance, but when you're actually there, you can see it, the Swayambhu Sri Chakra of Mata Chakreshwari. And I leave you with some modern Kashmiri renditions of the goddess. So Sharika Devi on the left in a painting, and Sharada Saraswati on the right. And you will recognize, apart from the signs of the goddesses themselves that are very clear, the Ashtabhuj for Sharika Devi, and the Veena, and the Kamandala, and the scriptures that she's carrying for Ma Saraswati, you will recognize the Pan-Indic ensigns on them very clearly. But what is typically Kashmiri about these representations is, one, again, the ferran, the long over dress that they are wearing, and the dejor. The dejor are these two long golden ornaments that are worn on both ears by Kashmiri women, typically Kashmiri married women. So this, and the headband also is very Kashmiri for women. So these are certain modern renditions of Kashmiri traditions of Shakti worship. Thank you very much. Abhayji, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kaul. A very interesting talk. Dr. Dixit, can you please unmute yourself and we can take questions?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kaul. There are a couple of questions which I would like to ask you. The one is, it says that, is there any book of yours which covers the items that you were the details you talked about, the information? No, I'm not able to hear because yours is on chat.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back.
Yeah. You're back.
Yes, a large part of the case that I'm making is in the making of early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in the Raj Tarangini. It is a book by me that came out in 2018, published by
Yeah.
Oxford University Press. Some aspects of Kashmir Shaivism and Shaktism you can also find in my book on Lalleshwari, the Kashmiri Yogini, which is called Looking Within, Life Lessons from Lal Diyat, published by Aleph last year in 2019.
I have that book name, so I will convey it to them also.
Other details about the goddesses themselves, no, that is fresh research, so it is not published yet, but hopefully it will be soon.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Anand Dabak wants to know, can you please little expound more on the top-down and bottom-up development of the Hinduism?
Okay, that's a huge topic, and I
just a couple of hint some of them.
See, there's a difference in how we understand any religion. Do religions or do godheads like, say, Krishna Vasudev or Shakti, forms of Shakti, Kali, for example, or even Ekanamsha or Balaram. I'm talking about examples from the Vaishnav and the Shakt family. Or Shiva himself is perhaps the biggest example, the best example of very popular folk roots. Because if you look at the depiction of Shiva, it is very antinomian. It is very anti-ideal. Because Shiva is the person who has actually left the settlement. He has left civilization. He roams around with matted hair. He smokes hash. He is surrounded by all kinds of characters who are terrifying in their appearance, even to Parvati at first sight. Right? So he is the very opposite, as it were, of a civilized godhood. And yet he is a great god in Hinduism. Where is he coming from? Where is this depiction coming from? To me, it is nothing but an example of how the Rudra who occurs in the Vedas, he is actually amalgamated with very folk traditions of deities, and to give rise to this conjoined godhead called Shiva. In the same way, Shakti, if you see her representation, especially, as I said, in her Raudra forms, which is her more popular form, the Mahishasur Mardini, when she's fierce and she's killing the demon, or when she loses all control and goes into this cosmic dance as Mahakali. And it takes no less than Shiva to actually stop this cataclysmic dance of hers. See her representation there. She's dark. She's very black, Kali, right? Black. Her hair is loose. It's not cultivated. It's not coiffed. She's wearing skulls around her neck, a horrific and an association with the Shamshan, with the cremation ground, not with civilization. And then what is she doing? She's actually enacting this dance where nobody can control her except this ultimate yogi called Shiva. Where is this figure, this earthy, very earthy, rustic, very wild even characterization of the goddess? Where is it coming from? It is hardly a Brahmanical or a top-down sattvic representation. It is not. It's a very earthy folk representation of what a goddess may look like and may behave like. And I can give you many more examples from the Krishna myth cycle as well, Balaram and so on. In fact, I've written about this. It's a paper of mine that's on academia.edu. These are all these major gods and their cults in Hinduism today. None of them have origins that are top-down. They are not imposed on any people. They're actually popular cults that are arising from the local beliefs of people. And Krishna, again, is a fabulous example. Because who is he? He's a cowherd. He's a cowherd who is intricately associated with, again, the land, the river, Yamuna, the Kalindi, the Bhandira tree, Vrindavan, the forest of Vrindavan, the cows. Everything about the mythology and the characterization of Krishna is so rustic, is so bucolic. There is nothing top-down about him. And yet these are the godheads. These are the supreme godheads of Hinduism. So the earlier belief that this Hinduism is something that was actually a centrifugal phenomenon, that Brahmins somehow over the centuries acting in some kind of concerted manner, which is undemonstrated in history, but nonetheless some scholars believe that Brahmins acting in concert over centuries actually carried these religious traditions to all parts of India, acculturating these and bringing them into the fold of Hinduism. What I'm saying to you is that the composition of Hinduism is actually far more democratic than that. Very clearly, the major gods of Hinduism were coming from the people themselves. And if anything, the Sanskrit texts are only reflecting that process rather than reflecting a process of imposition on the people.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for excellent explanation of that point. Another thing which someone is asking is, why do Kashmiris believe that visiting Wular Lake is not a good thing or is inauspicious? Is it correct?
I have not heard that before, but you must have heard it from somewhere. So perhaps you should interrogate your source. At least my sources are not talking about it. Maybe it's a much later day phenomenon. Maybe some mishap happened there, and, or maybe it's just the terrain, it's in the far north of Kashmir. It's not easy to get to these places. So maybe there's some such association, but I'm sorry, factually, I do not know.
Okay, and people, some of the listeners have given their comments like excellent talk, excellently explained, so on and so forth.
Thank you very much.
I think everybody has liked the talk immensely. There is one more question. Somebody wants, I think Mr. Apte, he wants to know some of the references, books which you mentioned them. Can you please mail it to me or?
Sure, they're a part of my bio note, Abhayji.
Yeah, your books are there. I'm talking about if anything else is also there. Any other book?
Did I refer to?
No, you can take time and then mail it to me in a day or two. We will inform all of the participants.
Oh, you mean on the topic? On the topic. Okay,
yeah,
sure.
on this topic,
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
On this topic.
My research tends to be based on the original sources. So I would recommend that you read the Nilmat Puran or you read the Raj Tarangani, because these are available in English translation.
Yeah, if you can give us something which, sorry, please go ahead.
Sure. But yeah.
No, I was saying that if a couple of English books, if they are available, and maybe because people will not be able to read Sanskrit easily and other Kashmiri, so we will need English books.
Yes, certainly. So they're all in English translation. I will certainly send the titles.
Yeah, please. Thank you. I think that we come to the end of the questions. It says there is one. I wanted to ask one question. I have been visiting Sri Lanka. This is by Galaxy A6. I don't know who's the person. I wanted to ask one question. I have been visiting Sri Lanka and going to Gokarna Hills. The goddess resides there as Shama Devi. She left Lanka with her Nagas. So is there anything connected with this Nagas which you mentioned?
Okay. Nagas, if you know Indian history broadly, you will immediately stand up and say, hey, Nagas are not exclusive to Kashmir. Nagas actually occur across the country in different geographic contexts. So you have Nagas being worshipped in Mathura. So Balaram, who is the elder brother of Krishna, is himself supposed to be a Naga god. And his characterization is also of a Naga. And you're getting a Naga temple from near Mathura from very early as well. So that's Mathura. Then when you come to Madhya Pradesh, the area around Sanchi, again, you're getting images of Nagas who are clearly being worshipped. And they are again in association with water bodies. Yeah. So reservoirs or tanks around Sanchi, that is where these ancient images of Nagas have been found. So again, you're seeing the same association between water bodies and Nagas, and you're finding it in central India. And now you're telling me about Sri Lanka. I am not surprised. So the Naga seems to be one of those motifs, water motifs. And in fact, I talk about this at length in the book, The Making of Early Kashmir, that who are the Nagas and how do we identify, how do we interpret them? Because earlier scholars have tended again to talk of Nagas as these pre-Brahmanical residents of Kashmir. There is no evidence in the characterization of the Nagas in any of these Sanskrit texts that I'm talking about from Kashmir of Nagas as some pre-Brahmanical human beings. They're not human beings. The representation of the Nagas is not as human beings. They are either as deities or they are as serpents, and often they are also shown as people who have the power to bring about precipitation. So snowfall, storms, rain, these kind of things are associated with Nagas in the early Kashmiri texts. Nowhere are they described as human beings, the term for which is Manava. So the Nilmat Puran gives an elaborate mythology where the Nagas are clearly distinguished from Manavas.
Okay.
So they're certainly not what we were told earlier they are, that they are the earliest residents of Kashmir. The Nagas are a motif. They are a literary motif, a cultural and religious motif, and a local belief, and that is found across the subcontinent.
Okay. Interestingly, I read that name Galaxy A6. Her name is Ashima Kaul.
Right. Welcome, Ashima. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think I have covered questions, and now I request Dr. Sucheta to give a vote of thanks to you and everyone.
Good evening, everybody. And before I give a vote of thanks, first let me appreciate the way you spoke, Shonalika. That was really wonderful. I mean, in spite of knowing so much Sanskrit, every time you speak, there is new information, which is very good. Thank you for that.
Very kind.
And thank you for your excellent lecture. And I would just like to point out a couple of points. One is what you said about religion is very true, that religion is very closely related and connected to the topography of a particular region. All over India, mountains, rivers, they are always connected with some kind of religious field or something, So, in fact, especially for Devi, that is a goddess,
yes,
it is seen that every time you take a darshan of goddess, you have to climb some steps and climb the mountains, whether it is Saptashrungi, Chatushrungi, or what is that name, Vani. And even in Kashmir, there is one Jammu, I forget the name, but every time you have to, sorry, Vaishno Devi. Yes, of course. I haven't been there, I didn't remember. Secondly, I would also like to say that what you said about Shakti is so true. And I personally believe that by belief, whether you are a Vaishnava or you are a Shaiva, that is whether you follow Vishnu cult or Shiva cult, ultimately you have to be a Shakta. Because Shakti is something which is common to both the cults, and therefore, as usual, as we see in every household all over the world, it is the woman who brings out and holds together the entire household and even the religious cults as such.
I just wanted to add at this point that Kashmiris are the one people who believe in all three. So Vishnu, Sri Krishna, Narayan, Shiva, and Shakti, they are almost of equal stature for Kashmiris. Huge.
Right. I think almost all over India we believe in that. But what I find very interesting is Shakti is common to both the cults. Whether you call her Uma or Rama or whatever, she is common to all of them. I must thank the viewers, because in spite of it being a festival, Dussehra or Mahanavami in some places, they have all come here to appreciate what you are offering. And thank you, viewers, for that. There is one more thing I want to say. I thank you, Shonalika, but I don't want to say goodbye, because I'm very sure that we will be inviting you over and over again to this platform to share your knowledge with all of us. Thank you, everybody.